Kirsty.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I know it's busy out there, so we really appreciate you taking the time out to join us today. We're going to be talking about target maps, maybe a little bit of housekeeping before we go. We are recording the session, and we'll share that recording with you, during the course of today. The chat is open, as you can see, and so is the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, Benny and Gary are on standby to answer those, so please post them in the chat, post them in the Q&A. If we don't get to all of them in the session today, we will respond to you, directly afterwards. So what are we covering today? Where's that first slide? There we go. So today's agenda, we're going to start with what is the value of target maps? Then we're going to look at a very basic example just to understand, are you aware of all the features that Target Maps has to offer? Are you using all of those features? How can you get the most out of Target Maps? Then we'll look at how you transition the client conversation from Asset Map to Target Maps. And we'll look at a couple of actual client scenarios. So, the scenarios where we get questions on a lot, the scenarios where we see some common mistakes coming through. So we'll work through those just to show you, what to watch out for. And then lastly, we'll look at some target map reporting and hopefully have some time at the end for any questions that you may have. Okay. So what is the value of target maps? Well, if you think of Asset Map shows the client their picture. So it's who are all the people in your life, who's important to you, what do you have in place already, and what does that look like? Target Maps answers that very important question that all clients want to know. Am I okay? And it does that by showing a client how funded they are for unexpected events that might happen, loss of life, disability, or the things that they're expecting, retirement. How funded are they towards achieving their goals? But most importantly, it's about helping a client understand where they are, but what they can do differently to further progress along that path. So how do we get you to 100% funded towards that goal? Now, today we're going to spend some time talking about, assumptions and the technical side. And I know that's a space that a lot of you love, but we always want to bring it back to what's the question we're trying to answer for the client? What's the purpose of this target map? And it's always to help the client understand how they can take a step forward. So we always want to bring it back to that conversation. So let's get going. I'm going to start with hold on a second. There we go. I'm going to start with just a very high-level basic example just to work through all the functionality. Also going to spend a bit of time talking about tax. I know there's a lot of questions around that and confusion around tax, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So let's meet James. So James has, a pretty standard picture in terms of what he has in place. You can see that James earns an income of 800,000 Rand a year. He's got...
Sorry,
yeah, just share that screen.
Oh, sorry. Let's try that again.
We're on your PowerPoint.
Okay, there we go. Can all see?
Cool.
So glad you guys are there.
Ah.
Okay, so here you can see James. James has an income of 800,000 Rand, and he's got 2 retirement funds in place at the moment. One is a preservation fund, and he's still contributing to this retirement annuity. If we look on this side, he also has a unit trust in place, some risk benefits at the top here, and a property and a bond at the bottom. So the first thing we're going to do is just look at all the functionality available in Target Maps. Step 1 is on this panel on the left-hand side here. I select Target Maps. And then I select this green button here to say New Target Map. Now, the first thing you'll see is this pop-up that shows you the system-wide templates we've built in place already. And we've got one for loss of life, disability, long-term care, so some sort of severe illness the client might have, education funding, retirement, and then custom. Now, the reason we've built these templates is that most planners with these particular clients are looking at these types of events. So there's templates built in the system with specific settings around what the client wants to achieve in each of those. Those settings are editable, so we can change them at a planner level to what you prefer and how you prefer to do that planning. But you can also edit it at a target map level. So we're going to start with retirement funding. Click that and select the individual. Great. Now you'll see as I create this target map, there'll already be a bar here. We can see that James is 49% funded. The reason we have that outcome already is because of the settings that we've added into the system. And we've done that on each of those events. Each target map consists of 3 components. What is it that the client wants to achieve? What do they have in place already? And what does that mean? So a summary of what that means for the client. So let's take a look at this example. If we go into what you want, you can see that from a settings point of view, we've told the system that in the event of retirement, we always want to replace 75% of the client's income. So we know that James was earning 800,000. So 75% is this 600,000. And that's from age 65 to age 90, increasing by a cost of living adjustment. So that's what COLA stands for, of 6%. Now, again, all of these are settings that can be edited. If you prefer to look at 100%, you can change it. If you want to always protect till age 100, we can change that, or even the COLA. The next line item here is we've said we also want to account for medical expenses of 10% of what James is currently earning from 65 to 90. And the reason for this additional line item is because we want that to increase at a different rate. So it gives us the ability to say, some expenses are going to increase by inflation. Others we want to increase at a higher than inflation percentage or perhaps a lower than inflation percentage. These line items can be completely edited for this particular target map. So I can click on this pencil. I can change the description if I want to retirement income as an example. I can change the amount to any amount that James wants to achieve. I can change the start and end date as well as that cost of living adjustment. I can also add any additional line items. So let's say James also wants to, ensure that he can go on holiday every year in retirement. I can add that in. Any other goals that the client has for this event. Now, what the model does now is it says, well, in that case, if these are the things you want to achieve, you would need a total capital amount today of 10.3 million, growing at 8% in order to achieve these goals. So that's always step 1. What is it that the client wants to achieve in retirement? Step 2 is to look at, well, what does this client have in place already? Now, when you select this What You Have tab, you'll see that it lists all the cash flow sources across the whole household in case you're using different incomes, assets from different people for certain goals. It also lists all the assets that the client has in the middle. And below that, you'll see it has all the insurance, not applicable in this one because we're looking at retirement, but therefore for the other goals that we may have. So the next step is to say, well, what is this client willing to allocate to retirement based on what they have already? And because we're in a retirement goal, we can see the models automatically allocated the client's preservation fund and their retirement annuity, as well as at the top here, their contributions to that retirement annuity. So in this case, we can see that he's contributing 120,000 Rand a year from now till retirement, and that's also been included in the goal. So what are some of the key things to watch out for? The first one is these contributions. For some clients, they're increasing those contributions every year. And you'll see the default is that it's not increasing. That COLA is on 0%. So here you can edit this line item and adjust the escalation. So if this client is contributing 120,000 to their retirement annuity, but they're also increasing it by inflation each year, then you can put that number in under this adjustment block and you'll see it'll update the map at the top. So that's one key thing just to watch out for. Whenever a client's contributing, you want to check, are they escalating those contributions? Do we want to build that in to this example? The next step is to look at the assets the client has. So in this case, the retirement funds have been allocated, but James also has a unit trust investment. If James wants to use that unit trust investment towards retirement, then we simply just tick it on the left-hand side here and it'll allocate it to this goal. So we can see James has now gone up to 72% funded towards retirement. Now let's talk about taxes. So how Target Maps looks at taxes, you'll see under the what you want section, it asks for the after-tax cash flow desired. The reason for that is that it's deducting tax in this column over here from the assets that the client has in place for that event. And from a settings point of view, we use 30% on retirement funds and 10% on discretionary funds. And that's based on, the scenarios that we've done, and we believe that's reasonable percentages. Why 30% on a retirement fund? Well, it may be in a retirement fund now, but we know over the lifetime of the client, this will move into sort of a living annuity. It'll generate income, which would then be taxed as income tax. Now, the thing with taxes is we don't know what tax is going to be over the next 40 years that we're doing this plan for. We don't even know what tax might be next year. But what we do have to be aware of, we have to take tax into account. So we have to make an assumption on tax, and we want that assumption to be reasonable. And we believe that 30% and 10% is reasonable, for 90% of the clients. Where you have outliers, clients that earn, really high income or really low income, you can always adjust this tax rate as applicable, for that client. But remember, the key thing we're trying to do is show the client based on where they're at now, we have to make an assumption for tax. What are the things you can do to move forward? So really the focus of this target map is on this gap over here. What do we do to fill that gap? So we've started with what you want. We know everything the client wants to achieve. We've allocated the investments and contributions that the client is putting towards retirement. The next step is to understand, well, what does that mean? And in this case, what it's showing us is that to achieve the things you want to achieve, we need that 10.3 million at 8%. What you have in place already is the equivalent of having 7.4 million today. The difference between those two is this shortfall over here. And what that's telling the client is that you either need 2.9 million in capital today, or you need to contribute 14,000 Rand a month, increasing at 6% for the next 20 years in order to bridge this gap over here. But what are the things that we can look at doing differently for James? We'll get to that in just 1 second. I just want to show you this last tab here. This cash flow model over here shows us the impact. What does it mean when we say to a client, you 72% funded? Well, this graph shows the client the income they need over time. So here you can see in each year, that's the income that James requires, and we can see it escalating here by inflation. The green bars show James's ability to meet that income with the capital that he currently has in place. So here we can see tangibly what does it mean to be this percentage funded, while your funds will start to run out in 2058. Okay. And below that, you can see a cash flow of each year, what's coming in and being added to the pot, how that pot is growing each year by that growth rate. And then you'll see here at 65, as James starts drawing from that, what that impact is on his total capital in this right-hand column. And when that column goes red, that's when James can no longer fund his income requirements. So there we can see that's at about age 82. But we can do things differently. We can look at different scenarios. So now we've created almost the current picture based on what you have at the moment, based on, where what you want to achieve and what you have. This is your picture. Now, right at the top here, you'll see there's some buttons that we can change things. The first thing we can do is edit the name of the scenario. So I'm going to edit this one, and I'm going to call this one the baseline scenario and update that. Now I can clone the scenario. In other words, make an exact copy, because in the copied scenario, I want to show James what he can do differently to progress along this bar. So I click on this clone button at the top right here, And now you'll see it's made an exact copy of that example. Now in this copy, I can open it up and I can show James something different here. So what if we targeted a higher return? If we target 9% instead of 8%, what impact does that have on James's graph? Well, then he goes from 72% to 94%, and he would need to save an additional 2,400 Rand per month. I can also show James, what if we put in that? What can you save additionally towards retirement? And I could either edit this retirement annuity contribution, or I can add a custom cash flow. So let's say to James, let's see the impact of an additional 1,000 Rand per month. So that would be 12,000. Remember, all these fields are calculator fields, so you can go, I did know how that's done, by the way, but I'll just put it in to show that calculator field. And then you can put in a start age and end age. So I can say he's now 45. Let's assume he contributes this till retirement. Let's assume he does increase it by inflation. And let's use the same tax rate we are on all the other retirement funds. And update. So how does that impact the plan? Well, now you go to 96% funded. So again, I can edit the name of this target map. I can say this is no longer the baseline. This target map is showing an additional, additional contribution of 1,000 per month at 9% return. So you can put in the name to really describe that scenario. I can update it, and you'll see it'll update at the top there. I can also, a new feature that was added recently is the ability to add notes. So in this note, I can say, income remains the same, but additional contribution, whatever those notes are, you can put in this note block over here, and that'll pull through to notes and pull through to reporting. Okay. So now if I go back here, I can see here's the additional contribution scenario. Here's my baseline scenario. I can also change the order of these scenarios. So I could pull this one up if I want that at the top, and I want this scenario underneath that. So the key conversation we're trying to answer for James, or the question we're trying to answer, is how on track are you currently? While based on what you have at the moment, you're 72% funded. What can we do to move you forward? I've just shown you 2 examples, but there's lots of different things you could do. You could work longer, he could reduce the income amount, target a higher return, save more. But I'm showing 2 of those options by saying, let's see if you add an additional 1,000 Rand per month and we target a slightly higher return, then you become 96% funded. So you can see how we're creating the story, we're answering the question, and we're showing the clients how they can move forward. Yeah, so that's the basics. That's, sort of all the functionality within target maps. Now let's take a look at how you would transition a client conversation from the asset map picture into target maps. So in this example, I'm going to look at the Parkers. So we have Joe and Jenny Parker. They have 2 children, Kyle and Jessica. And if we have a look at what they have in place already, we can see they've got incomes on both sides. They've got some retirement and investments, emergency funds in place already. They've got risk benefits at the top here that they have in place, and they've got property with a loan. Now, if I just look at this client's asset map, the questions coming out for me is, if we look at James's salary, he's earning 800,000 at the moment. And if we look at what he has in place for life cover, we can see he's got about 6.2 million. So the question here is really, is that enough to fund the income replacement that James would need if something happened to him? We can also see that he's got disability benefits here in place. But again, the same question, is that enough to fund what they would need if something happened to Joe? But how do I introduce that conversation with the client? In Asset Map, if you click on the Reports tab here at the bottom, there's a report known as the Financial Fire Drills, or the 6L report. And you can generate it here under Reports by just clicking this download button, and it'll generate with the client's name on and your branding on. But it's a great document to work through with the client. So I'm going to hop over here. This is what it looks like. Why is it called financial fire drills? Well, these are usually the 6 things that could, disrupt a family's plan that they have in place. So we call it the fire drills, or 6 L's, because each one of the 6 starts with an L. But it's really about understanding and working through these events with the client to see, do they have a plan in place for those events? What is that plan? Let's understand it. So the first one is liquidity needs. So the conversation with the client there is, if something should happen, you get retrenched, what is your plan in that event? If we take a look at your asset map, show me what your plan is in that event, because most clients may have some idea, in that case, I've got this emergency funding, I've earmarked it for that, or, I'll access my bond potentially, or whatever their plan is. This is about understanding what's in their mind and just making notes of that and seeing, does it require modification? Same for long-term disability, loss of life, long-term care. Should a severe illness happen and disrupt, your family, what's the plan in place for that? Longevity, do we have enough to cover living expenses, education, medical, vacations for your lifetime? Legal liability and legacy. Is there a will in place? What's the plan in those situations? But by working through this document with the client, you can jot down what their plan is and then use target maps to show them, based on what they have in mind to cover these things, are they on track or not? How funded are they? And are there any gaps that we need to look at? So if we look back at the Parkers, for example, let's say that going through the 6L document, speaking to Joe about should something happen to him, he mentions that, yes, he's got group life cover in place and life cover, and that's sort of his plan in the event of death. That'll help, cover the family for what they need. And for disability, he's got lump sum disability and income disability in place, and that'll cover the family. Okay, great. Now let's use target maps to take a look at those 2 scenarios and see, is that enough to cover it? Are there any gaps that we need to look for? So the first one I'm going to look at is loss of life. And I'm going to focus it on if something should happen to Joe for this example. But here's another key point, or a common thing that we see happening when looking at loss of life. The first question we need to ask is, if something happens to Joe, okay, are we just trying to protect his income? So replace his income for the household? Or are we looking at the entire household and saying, for the family, what would they need entirely should something happen to Joe? And the reason why that's important, and we'll get into it more in target maps, is that it impacts what we allocate to the goal, depending on what we're looking at. So let's assume for this example, we're just going to focus on Joe, on replacing Joe's income. Then when I go into target maps, and I create loss of life, I'm going to select Joe, because we're looking at if something happens to Joe, and create it. Now, again, because I've put settings in, it's going to come up with a picture already. And let's have a look at what the settings are for loss of life. So under what you want, you'll see that we start by saying replace income at 70%. So we know Joe is earning 800,000. 70% is this 560,000 Rand number. And we've automatically set that from age 50 to 90. Then we've also asked the model to please cover any debt obligations. So this is the bond that they have together. To allocate an amount of just straight 150,000 for any final expenses. Of course, I can edit that amount again to show if there's additional expenses or, estate duty, anything that I want to put in there, I can. It's also said, make sure there's 100,000 Rand a year for both the children from 18 to 22. And you can see that's increasing at a higher rate there. As we know, all of us with children know education is definitely not keeping in line with inflation. And lastly, allocates an amount of 625,000 for emergencies. So just a once-off, have this amount available. So those are the settings. But again, I can edit all of that. So let's say in this example, Joe says, should something happen to me, our expenses won't be as high as they are now. We've allocated an amount for the bond. So actually my spouse would only need about 480,000 Rand a year. That's fine. Then let's edit it here. So that's 40,000 a month. And let's just make sure that she has that for 25 years. So I'm going to go to 75. Okay. And that'll update the plan and show the difference of that. Now, because I'm only replacing Joe's income, when I take a step now into what you have in place already, I often see this question come up is, do I allocate Jenny's salary to this goal? And that's where that question comes in. If you're looking at replacing the income the family needs, and Jenny is going to continue working, then of course you allocate Jenny's salary. But if we're just saying, I'm just looking at protecting Joe's income, Jenny will still work and receive her income, but at the moment they're using this 800,000 and that 450,000. So I can't allocate Jenny's salary if I'm just protecting Joe's income. So under here, if I go back into target maps and I select the what you want section now, I won't include Jenny's salary at the top here. Had I put in what you want, the full amount, then I could have allocated, how long Jenny would be working for and what that income would be and bring to the plan. The second question is, if you look right at the bottom, we can see it's already allocated Joe's life cover. He's got group life cover and standard life cover, adding up to 6.2 million. That's automatically allocated to this goal because we're looking at the event of Joe dying. But now I can say, well, what assets could be used towards that goal as well? And remember, again, I'm not going to select Jenny's assets because she's going to need that for her own planning in this scenario. So I'm only going to look at Joe, but Joe does have a unit trust. He does have his employer fund. So I'm going to allocate those two to the goal. Okay. And what does it tell me at the top here? What does this mean? It means that based on what you require, you would need 12.8 million in today's terms, invested and growing at 8% if you were to die today to meet all of those needs that we've listed under what you want. Based on what you have already, there's a deficit of 1.8 million at the top here. Now I can have a conversation with Joe to say, well, what can we do to fill that deficit, to this gap over here? We could, of course, look at life cover. We could, of course, change the goals. We could target a higher return, which is probably not, great in the event of death because we don't know, what the spouse is going to want to target. But now I can start looking at different options for Joe. So key thing here again is, what's the question we're trying to answer? Should something happen to Joe, is Jenny and the family okay? What would we need to do to make sure that they are? Okay, so that's loss of life. Going to look at disability for a second as well. Let's open up disability. Now, here's another key one that we have to think about and be aware of with disability, and that is the timeline. So you'll see under the settings for disability, we've built in to also replace income 75 or 70% from now until retirement. But the key thing there is that if I'm only looking at disability up until retirement, then I'm assuming that Joe is fine for retirement planning because that's going to kick in at age 65 and he'll have that income. So there's two options here again. Either I look at Joe and I say, in the event of disability, I want to make sure Joe has enough income to age 90. In that case, or 100 as an example, in that case, I can allocate Joe's retirement assets to this goal. But if I'm saying I'm only looking up until retirement, and I know that that's also because disability benefits often end at retirement, and that's why we look at it to retirement, then you'll see, then I have to take into account the fact that during this period, Joe is still going to need to save for retirement so that he is okay from 65 onwards. So just something to be aware of. Always ask yourself, am I looking over the entire period or am I just looking up to retirement? And that will determine what I allocate to the goal and what I take into account. So in this case, because we're looking up until retirement to age 65, I've added an additional line item to say, not only does Joe need the 600,000, but he also needs an additional 80,000 Rand a year from now till age 65 to make sure he can continue to save for retirement. Okay, so that's step one. What that means from a what you have section is, again, I can't allocate any salaries. And from an insurance point of view, I can allocate the income disability that Joe has, this 40,000, increasing by inflation, and the lump sum that Joe has of 2.1 million. But when it comes to the asset section, I'm only protecting Joe till age 65. If I start allocating his assets now that he needs for retirement, then I'm using them before 65. So in this situation, you wouldn't allocate any assets because you want to keep that for retirement. If, however, under what you want, I did it till age 95 or 100, then of course I can allocate the retirement assets. So neither one is right or wrong. It's just depending on what you want to show, but just be aware, whichever one you're doing, that is how you would then allocate. So what is this telling me? Well, it's telling me that in the event of disability, whilst Joe does have income protection and capital disability, he is still short by 540,000 Rand. All right, so that is loss of life and long-term disability. The other thing I want to show here is the ability to create a custom goal. So we realize that, yes, we've got settings for loss of life, disability, all the typical ones, but every client may have different goals that they want to achieve, and you need the flexibility to be able to add any goal. So if you wanted to add a specific goal that falls outside of that realm, you would select custom. And under custom, I can put in any description of what I want this goal to be. So I'm going to say overseas holiday, just because that's what I'd really want. So I'll select Joe and create it. Now you'll see there's no template that comes up. There's no graph that immediately appears. I now have to put in, what does Joe want to achieve with this holiday? So under what you want, I can add a desired cash flow. I can call it whatever I want. So overseas trip, and put in the amount. So let's say it's 200,000. It's a very lavish holiday. And when does Joe want to go on that holiday? So let's say it's 50 now and he wants to go at age 53. Whenever you are adding a once-off, a one-year expense or a once-off expense, you put in a start age and you leave the end age blank because it's once off, it's not ending. The only time you put a start age and the end age in is if it's a recurring annual expense. Okay, so if he was going on holiday every year, then I'd put that in, but in this case, we're planning for a once-off holiday. Then isn't 200,000 at that point in the future, or do you want the equivalent of 200,000 today? If you want the equivalent, so he wants 200,000 in today's terms, but he knows in the future he's going to need a bit more to have the same experience as you would today. So we're going to add an escalation of 6% in here and create it. What the model is showing us now that, he would need capital today of 189,000. So you can see it at the top here. If he had 189,000 today and we invested it at 8%, he would have enough to cover the holiday in 3 years, I think it's 3 years, with an inflated amount, so what 200,000 would be worth then. But it also shows me what he would need to save every month, increasing at inflation for the next 3 years to have that holiday. But now I can still say, maybe Joe has some investments and he's willing to allocate all of it or a portion of it towards this goal. So Joe says, I've got this unit trust investment. I want to allocate just 150,000 of that to this goal and see what more I need to save in order to achieve that. So instead of just selecting the unit trust here, I can actually just allocate an amount of this investment. It's not going to change the value of the investment in asset map or any of the other target maps. It's specific to this particular target map. So I can put in the amount that's available, update that, and now we can see, let's just tick it, sorry. included in the target map. And now we can see, okay, you're 71% funded towards that holiday. And now you only need to save an additional amount of 1,544 Rand a month to go on that holiday. And you can really use these custom ones for anything, paying off a loan, buying a house, any sort of goal that the client has. You can show the impact of that by adjusting what they want and allocating what they have already towards it. Okay. Everyone's still with me. Oh, another actual example. This one comes up also quite a lot. You know, what if I have a client that's not saving for retirement, so they're not working still, they're already retired? Can I still use target maps to work through this scenario? 100% you can. How do we do that? Well, let's take a look at this client. She's 67 at the moment, and let's see what she has in place. So she's got her home. She's got a living annuity of 7 million and a unit trust of 1.8 million. What income is she getting at the moment? So we know that she needs 480,000 Rand a month, or a year, sorry. That's the income she requires. At the moment, she's getting that via a guaranteed annuity that pays out 120,000 Rand a year. So we know that's guaranteed. She's definitely getting that for the rest of her life. She also rents out, you know, the flat on her house, and she has an income from that flat of 80,000 Rand per year. So if we make the assumption that that's staying, and she'll continue to get that. But then the difference, currently the difference between the 480,000 she needs and the 200,000 she has already, she is drawing from her investment. So from this living annuity and this unit trust. So the first thing we need to understand is, what is the question we're trying to answer for her? And in this case, because some of the income is guaranteed, the question we're trying to answer is, can this living annuity and this unit trust continue to provide this additional income that she's drawing for a lifetime? That's the question. So how do we answer that? Pop over into target maps, and here we've got the retirement scenario. First thing is, what does she want? So this is not the income, just the income she's getting, but the income she needs. So we know she needs 480,000. Currently, she's getting that from 3 different sources, but this is what she needs. And what we've said is she needs it. Let's see, is it sustainable to age 100? So now she's in retirement already. We want to check, you know, should she live till 100? Can that living annuity and that unit trust sustain the extra drawdown that she's taking from them? So the next question is, what does she have already? And here's another common thing that we see is, what do I allocate to this? Well, in this case, I'm going to allocate the guaranteed annuity. That's guaranteed. She's getting that to age 100. So we know of the 480 she needs, 120 is taken care of. And that's from age 67 to 100 again. Then the rental income, I know we could say that's probably not as guaranteed, but I'm going to select that and assume she continues to get that rental income to age 100. But now it comes down to the living annuity and the unit trust. We can't select the assets and the drawdown that she's taking from those assets, because that would be double counting. That income isn't guaranteed income. And the question we're trying to answer is, can this living annuity and this unit trust sustain the difference between what she needs and what she's getting from the guaranteed annuity and the rental income? So in this case, I'm going to tick the unit trust, I'm going to select the living annuity, and what the model is calculating now is to say, if you keep drawing 480,000 and you keep getting the 120 and the rental income, these assets are 86%, you're 86% funded to support that additional 280,000 that you're currently drawing. Now, what does that mean tangibly for the clients? If we hop over to this graph over here, we can see that the income that you require is in these bars over here, and we can see that escalating. The blue is showing the guaranteed annuity and the rental income. So that's standard, and you'll continue to receive that. But if you draw the 280,000 from your discretionary and living annuity, you will eventually deplete that. Now, I know there's the 17.5 rule on the living annuity, but remember, we're just trying to answer, is it sustainable? What could we do to make it more sustainable in this case? And what we're saying here is there's going to be a gap over here if we don't start managing that income a little bit differently or the growth rates a little bit differently. So again, what are the options that we can look at for the clients? The options are, we could reduce this income, but is that, feasible? If that's what the client needs, how can we look at that? And perhaps there's options around, showing two scenarios, one where you do reduce the income, one where you keep it as is, and show the client sort of, we've got to keep the income within this range and manage it over time, depending on if the markets do well, if the markets don't do well, but we've got to manage between that range to ensure that you can sustain this income need. Of course, we could target a higher return. That would then change the picture as well. But given that the client is already retired, perhaps we don't want to take on that risk. So in this case, I would clone the scenario and show just a different scenario of where it does last or how to make it last a little bit longer. So let's see if I were to drop this income need. Yes, Gary also pointed out you could change the end age, but if we want to show it lasting to 100, but that is another option. If I sort of reduce this income and said, well, what if we reduced it by 5,000 Rand a month? I think my math is right. What would that look like? Okay, in that case, you're 98% funded and it's lasting all the way here to 2054. So not necessarily to show the client, to change it today, but to say, here's the two scenarios, one with 40,000 and one with 35,000 a month. And if we keep it between that range and manage that income drawdown, then, we can make sure that it lasts. And maybe there's other options of downscaling the home and bringing a portion of that in as well. We could look at that option as a third scenario too. So there's different ways of looking at it, but to show you, always again go back to what's the question we're trying to answer. What are we trying to show the client? How do we show them a picture that helps the client make an informed decision of the impact of what they're doing now, and if they did something differently, what that would look like over time. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk through is reporting and what sort of reporting you can get out of asset map and target maps. So the first thing I want to talk on is just notes. There's 3 areas where you can add notes now to a financial plan for the client, but also to the asset map. Under the individual, so if you select any individual on the map, there's a notes tab and you can put notes in across that individual. You can also put notes on any block on the page. By selecting notes, you can put notes in there. And thirdly, you can now, we're very excited, add notes to target maps. You can really describe the specific scenario, what you looked at in the scenario, and add notes in at the top here. All of those notes pull through to this notes tab on the left-hand side. So you can always view the notes across a client, and you can edit them on this tab as well if the note is there. But from a reporting point of view, if you select reports on the bottom left-hand side here, you can see that there's different chapters that you can select, and one of those chapters is notes. So you can select notes and include it in your reports. You can also, as recently, you can reorder these chapters. So let's say I want notes to be between asset map and target maps. I can drag it and put it in the position that I want, and then simply generate the report. Under target maps, I can also select which scenarios I want to include in the report. So let's say I want to just include the one retirement scenario, perhaps, or I don't want to include this long-term care. I can simply untick the ones I don't want to include. You can also include the cash flow report. Now, I don't suggest doing that with clients. I think it's a lot of detail and gets complicated, but we do have those clients that want to see that cash flow. If you do, you can always include it in the report, but keeping this right-hand column is really just that funded portion and how on track is the client. And then you can generate the report at the top here, just to give you an example of what one would look like. Once you've generated that, you have your cover page, you have your asset map pictures or any layouts that you've chosen, showing the client, this is where we are today. This is all the people in your life and everything that you have today. Then I've put the notes in the middle to just talk about what we spoke about, what we've agreed to do, target map specific scenarios and what we've decided under there. And then it shows the target map summary. So I love this page. It's always quite colorful, but it also shows the client just how on track are you across all the different scenarios or events that you want to, or goals that you want to achieve. And you could have multiple scenarios here to show this is the baseline, this is what we agreed to do, and this is the impact. And then it'll go through each one of those in a bit more detail to show all the assumptions that have been included, what you want on the one side and what you have on the other side, and the outcome at the top. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Benny, Gary, any questions that have come through?
First, maybe open for questions. We've sort of been dealing with the questions as they've arisen.
Perfect.
Yeah, but let's open up. Let's see if anybody has any specific questions they want to deal with.
Okay. You can just pop it on.
As ever, that was awesome. As usual, I learned a lot.
Me too. I'm also taking notes.
Great, Gary. I'm glad.
I think everybody's
Questions coming through. I don't know if you guys can see anything coming through there. One new message.
Franz saying
just
thanks very much.
Feedback saying great job, Kirsty.
Awesome. Thanks, Franz. All right. Well, if there are any other questions or anyone wants to work through it one-on-one, we're always here. So please just pop us a WhatsApp, send us an email, and we can get